Faithful God, fragile people, the gospel through Genesis, the mercy of the limp, Genesis chapter 32 today. And that's a good one as we move along, and we're looking at the patriarchs and their lives and what has gone on with them and the lessons that we learn from there. Next slide, getting started, demolition work in progress. Yikes. Sometimes God has to break us down before He rebuilds us. So teaser, God often has to dismantle our self-sufficiency to give us a new identity rooted in His grace. Does that make sense? Sometimes if we think we're able to do too many things, if we have that sense of self-sufficiency, God has to take that away in order to make sure that our identity, who we are and what we're able to do, is rooted in His grace. We spend much of our lives trying to be someone else or trying to protect the someone we've carefully curated. So we're going to be looking at Jacob today, but we're also going to look at a little bit of Isaac before that, because I think can't really miss him either, although there isn't as much information there for us to follow on that part of the account. Next slide. Yikes. Kaylee, does that bring back bad memories? Yeah. The idea of a bone break, right? An orthopedic reset. We've heard of this. Sometimes you have a break and it doesn't heal right, and then the doctor has to go in and re-break it in order to make it work. That doesn't sound comfortable.
Batteries say 2023.
We'll take a look at the slide here. When a bone heals incorrectly, it remains weak and functional, but it can be constantly painful. To truly heal, it needs a surgeon to sometimes perform a controlled break, to re-break it and reset it so that it can set straight. It feels like a regression because now you have to go back and recover again, but it's actually the only path to a permanent fix. And sometimes you have to go back and deal with that pain again to recover, instead of the lingering pain of it remaining broken. So click for me. In Genesis 32, Jacob is at a river called Jabbok, the river of decision. You like that one? Interesting name for a river, right? The river of decision. He is caught between the past that he can't outrun, because he messed things up with Esau, with his brother. He caused problems in the family and he left in order to not be killed. This is years later. He has that part on one side of the river. He's caught between a past that he can't outrun, but he also has a future that he can't manipulate. And if you know Jacob in the account, that's his process, is if I can't get my way, I will manipulate. Still got nothing. Anyways, so there's a tension here. This idea of there's a wrestling for a gift. I want a blessing. It didn't take me long to find images of people wrestling for a gift. That it's women we won't talk about. Anyways, the men ones were really violent. Let's go to the slide. We'll continue to wrestle for a blessing through our own strength, or will we surrender to the one who wants to give it to us as a gift? Do we accept that, or do we just wrestle it out of God's hands? I want this blessing, give it to me. Well, that's what happens in Jacob, right? He has this wrestling with God. Click ahead. And we'll go to the thesis, next one. Our true spiritual and emotional stability begins when we realize that our limp, because you know the account, the limp, he gets touched in the side in the socket, and he has this limp. The limp is a great testimony of God's grace. He comes out of this encounter wrestling with an angel or wrestling with God, but he has a limp, and that limp could actually be a sign of God's grace. God didn't just let him go in the direction that he had always been going. He had interrupted him and changed him and said, you're going to slow down. You're not going to be a runner. You have to rely on me. But before we get to Jacob, because we ended up with Abraham, right? So all of a sudden we're Abraham and then Jacob. Well, what happened to Isaac? What happened to that child that he took up to the firewood that we looked at last week? We'll go ahead. Before we step into the darkness of the Jabbok with Jacob, we have to look at the man who stands between the mountain and the river, and that's his father, Isaac. If Abraham is the pioneer and Jacob is the pursuer, Isaac is often the one who simply endures. His stories are okay. We often miss them because it just feels less cinematic. But in the missing chapters between Abraham and today, we see a God who is profoundly faithful to a man who was definitely fragile. One of the ways that he was fragile is he was fragile in grief. In Genesis 24:67, we find Isaac still reeling from the loss of his mother. Then Isaac brought her into his tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. That's Genesis 24:67. Here's a man that is defined by a quiet ache. God's faithfulness to Isaac wasn't just this big grand covenant, it was the tender provision of compassion to a grieving heart. He's fragile. God is faithful. He was fragile in grief, but he was also fragile in fear. In Genesis 26, we see Isaac repeating his father's mistake. He lies about his wife because he was terrified of the locals, something Abraham had also done. Yet in his anxiety, God meets him in the middle of the night in Genesis 26:24. He says, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you. Even after he had done this mistake, sin, same thing, followed the same pattern. Isaac didn't have to be a hero to inherit the help of heaven. He just had to be present. So Isaac, although less cinematic, sees God's faithfulness show up in his grief, in his fear, and also when he's fragile in body and spirit. By the time we reach the end of Isaac's story, he's a man whose eyes were so dim that he could not see, Genesis 27:1. He is physically blind, but he is also deceived by his own family. Remember? The blessing. He's fragile. And they take advantage of it. Isaac's life teaches us that God's covenant doesn't skip a generation just because the generation feels average or overwhelmed. Is that something powerful? He isn't the great patriarch like Abraham, father of the faithful. He isn't even, as we're going to look at with Jacob, he isn't a Joshua, he's an Isaac. But even in that, God was faithful to him. God watched over him, he blessed him. Isaac spent his life redigging his father's wells in Genesis 26:18 because he knew that he didn't have the strength to dig new ones. He lived in the shadow of a great father and in the chaos of the manipulative son. You like that spot? He lives in the shadow of a great father, Abraham, like who can live up to that, and the chaos of a son that's known as a manipulator. And Isaac is just getting by. But sometimes just getting by is an act of faith. It's out of this fragile middle, this home of blindness and blessing, of quiet grief, of steady providence. God has never given up, that we have Jacob emerging. Jacob didn't learn to wrestle out of a vacuum. He learned to wrestle in a home where the blessing was something you had to grab because you felt like there wasn't enough to go around. Does that make sense? If you can get a blessing from mom and dad, you better grab it because it's gone quick. And you got to fight between everybody else and you got to get your own. That's kind of where Jacob comes from. That atmosphere of grab it before it's gone. Next slide. Kind of like this. He didn't have to wrestle out of the vacuum, did he? That his environment made a difference into how he viewed himself and how he viewed God. Next one. Jacob spent 20 years in exile, outmaneuvering his uncle Laban. Now he's coming home, and he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men. And what was the last thing they talked about? If I see again, I'm going to kill you. So that might have been playing on his mind a bit. And he hears that his brother's coming, and his brother has 400 men. That's where we're picking up today's story. There's a strategy of fear. Jacob does what Jacob does best. He manipulates, doesn't he? He sends gifts. He divides the family into camps. But he stays behind. He's the last one to get attacked if somebody's going to get attacked. He knows how to protect himself, and everybody else is expendable. All of his family, all of his property, everything will go before they'll get me. And he stays behind. And in that encounter, he has a wrestling match. It's one of the most mysterious passages in Scripture. A man, at the beginning it says he wrestled with a man, wrestled with him until daybreak. But is that also a sign of his internal conflict? His wrestling with where he's at and what he's going to do? Jacob isn't just wrestling a stranger, he's wrestling with God, a God who he's also tried to manage and manipulate for decades. And he finds out you can't just beat God, and you can't just win against him. So there's a turning point. They wrestle, neither of them gives up. The stranger touches Jacob's hip. With one touch, the grasper, the one who grabs on, becomes the clinger, the one that won't let go. He can no longer fight, but he can only hold on. Do you have times in life where the fight got kicked out of you? And all you can do is just hang on? You can't really push back. You're not going to make a difference, but you're too tired to quit, and all you can do is just hang on. And that's where we get to in this encounter. Genesis 32, 22 through 32, page 53. Here's the text. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, which are Leah and Rachel. Genesis 30, remember that encounter? There's some history there. His 2 female servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, they are mothers of 4 of his children. And then it says his 11 sons, because one of those sons hasn't been born yet. Who was the last son? Benjamin. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. And probably for the first time in a long time, so Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. He had a lot to manage, and he probably kept himself busy with a lot of things. There was always somebody and something around him. But for the first time in a long time, it's him at a river about decision. And who does he encounter? God. You ever been there? When it gets down to you and no one? You and God. And now we're going to have a talk. We're going to have an encounter. Next slide. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I'll not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob replied, "I'll not let you go unless you bless me." The angel couldn't overcome him either. That's a good sign. Or God himself. He wants a blessing out of the deal. What's the next part? Because there's a question. Go ahead. The man asked him, "What's your name?" What's your name? Is that usually a usual question or an unusual one? Say it. Tell me who you really are. What name does he have to give? I am Jacob. What's the name mean? What's it represent? I am a supplanter, a deceiver. I am a liar. I'm a manipulator. Say it. Confess before God. I know who I am. It's not just what is your name. Why were you given that name? Why have you lived up to it your whole life so far? You see why his name gets changed to Israel? You don't have to be a deceiver anymore. You don't have to manipulate. You can give that up. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel." Because what's that name mean? He struggles with God. He contends with God. He's in a connection with God, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. So his name is changed. And we know of Israel today. It's the same name. Named after the people, named after this is the change from Jacob to Israel and Israelites. And incidentally, the term Jew, if you wonder where that comes from the term he who praises God in Genesis 29:35. Which is why it's interesting as it comes up in Romans chapter 2, but that's a different discussion. Verse 29, Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, because that name means face of God, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Verse 31 says, the sun rose above him, and as he passed Peniel, he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. You see in verse 32 how quickly it changes. Therefore, to this day, who? The Israelites. Named after Jacob, who just had his name changed to Israel. The Israelites, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Transitional chapter, transitional section. A faithful God and a fragile person. Next slide. Looking to Jesus, do we see a parallel between this? Between God coming and addressing him, directing him, fighting with him while he's alone? Sure. We see the gospel most clearly in the wound of the story. We have three things here. Go ahead. The divine vulnerability, the ultimate wound, and the finished work. The man allows himself to be wrestled with. God stoops to Jacob's level. God comes down, and it points us to the incarnation. Jesus, the man who stepped into the ring of humanity to come and wrestle with us, deal with us, make us deal with him. There's a wound mentioned here. On the cross, Jesus wrestled by the judgment we deserved. His side was pierced, his body was broken, so that we could be blessed. The damage that he took on changed those that followed him. Same way that Jacob's damage changed those that followed him. And there's a finished work. Jacob asked for a blessing and got a new name. Jesus was cursed. He lost his name. He was called forsaken, so that we could be given the name child of God. There's a transition there as well. Some good parallels between them. But let's talk about the shadow of the Father, next couple slides here. In biblical counseling, we don't just look at the individual, we look at the family system, don't we? Who you are and how you were raised in your early environment, all of that can make a difference to who you are. Jacob didn't become a grasper in a vacuum. He was raised in the fragile middle of Isaac's home. There's a legacy of passivity. Isaac was often characterized by what he didn't do. Not what he did do. Isaac's often characterized by what he didn't do. He didn't stop the favoritism in his home. He didn't confront deception. He retreated into blindness and his appetite. In family systems, a parent's passivity often creates an anxious vacuum. What happens when a parent doesn't step up for their faith? When they don't stand out for being faithful? What happens when that foundation isn't there for the kids? When a father is emotionally or spiritually dim-sighted, the children often feel that they must be overfunction or manipulate to get security. Well, that's been going on a long time. And then there's the scarcity myth, the next thing. Jacob's grasping was a direct response to a home where blessings felt like a limited resource. When Isaac said, "I have blessed him, yes, and he shall be blessed," in Genesis 27:33, it confirmed Esau's worst fear, that there wasn't enough to love to go around. Jacob's life was a frantic attempt to solve a scarcity problem that didn't actually exist in God's economy. Just because his parents may have left it so that love was conditional, God's love wasn't. But that scarcity may have changed him. Jacob wrestled Jacob's wrestling match at the Jabbok was the moment he stopped trying to outrun his father's passivity and his brother's wrath. When God touched his hip, he wasn't just breaking a bone, he was breaking a generational cycle. The limp was God's way of saying, you no longer have to run because you can no longer rely on your own speed. And every time he got up to run, he couldn't do it because he was reminded, you can't run. That torn hip reminded him every day, you can't run. Quit it. Stay with me. I'm with you anyways. It becomes a sign of God's grace. Many of us are still grasping today because we're trying to compensate for a fragility of those who came before us. We work too hard, control too much, trust too little because we're afraid maybe that blessing is going to run out. Maybe it's not available. Maybe I can't meet those conditions. But at the Jabbok, Jacob learns that the blessing isn't something you steal from a father. It's something you receive from the Father. No matter what. He couldn't change his relationship with his dad. But if he understands what God is offering, it's going to change him completely. Let's talk about the pattern of the king, Jesus, our strength and weakness. There's a paradox here. Jacob was strong enough to wrestle all night, but he was only blessed when he became too weak to stand. True? When he relied on his own strength, he could wrestle with God and keep him at a distance, but when he broke down, he got rebuilt. But he was only blessed when he became too weak to stand. Paul learns this in 2 Corinthians 12. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect. Where? When Paul accepted what God was offering, it changed him too. We don't trust in our achievements, rejoice in the God who uses our brokenness. Sometimes that's how we get rebuilt. So here's some application questions. The Jabbok question, what river are you currently sitting by? What's the thing you're most afraid of facing tomorrow morning? Where's your point of decision? Now's the time to confront this thought, feeling, behavior, to really settle into it and say, I don't want to think about this, but it's time to think about this. If God asked you your name today, not your representative name, but the name of your struggle, what would you say? Yes, God, I know that I'm fearful, or I'm an addict, or I'm a controller, or I'm unworthy, or what's your name? Will you confess before God what He already knows? Confess just means to agree with. And the practice is this week identify a limp in your life, a weakness or past mistake that makes you feel less than. Instead of hiding from it, thank God for it. Say, Lord, thank you for this limp because it reminds me that I cannot walk without you. True? If it wasn't for your inadequacies, would you really rely on God the same way? So we can be thankful that He hasn't made us perfect, but we're better together. The place that he names it is Peniel. The next slide. Jacob named the place Peniel, saying, I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. He walked away into the sunrise, wrestled all night. The day started again. He walked into the sunrise limping and blessed. The struggle of the night had turned to the full sun of a new day. He was no longer a fugitive. He was a prince. But he walked with a limp, and that reminded him, as we'll talk about next week, when he meets Esau, he does it with a different attitude. Next week, we're going to look at Jacob changed by the private encounter. This week was that private encounter with God. Next week is the public result of that change. The change at the Jabbok occurs before Genesis 33 about the public result. Jacob finally faces Esau, and we'll explore how God, the God who goes before you, how in all of this, all of these years of tension, that was already God at work. Reconciliation was ready. The God who goes before you works in our hearts of our enemies while we're still wrestling in the dark. We'll learn that reconciliation is possible not because we're good at it, but because God is already there and He's likely already been at work. So the benediction today, May the God who wrestles with you in the dark stay with you until the dawn. Pretty good one. May the God who wrestles with you in the dark stay with you until the dawn. May the Spirit of Christ transform your grasping into clinging. Instead of greedily wanting more, just hold on to God. And may you walk this week with the holy confidence that your weaknesses are simply the place where God's strength is most visible. It's okay to be not okay. Right? Because that's maybe where God can really shine. Amen? Sermon 5. Next week, something we haven't had to deal with for a while, the snowplow. It'll make sense. The snowplow of grace from Genesis 33. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for being in God's Word together.